morning. I'm Ginny Lobel with Defined Health, and we welcome you to another edition of our Insight Series webinars. Today, Ginger Johnson, Vice President of Defined Health, will present CNS Orphans and Disease Subsegments, The Road Less Traveled. Defined Health is pleased to bring you these webinar presentations as a way of showcasing how we view and think about looking forward various critically relevant topics for the biopharmaceutical industry. Our viewpoint is the result of our long history of consulting with hundreds of pharma, specialty pharma, biotech, and investor clients. To these engagements, we bring our unique perspective grown over 30 years of evaluating pipeline and inline opportunities by bridging our knowledge of drug development, business development, and commercial strategy across multiple therapeutic categories, disease areas, and technology platforms. I want to quickly call your attention to two of our in-person events happening in March of 2014. Defined Health will present the 25th Annual Cancer Progress Conference in New York in March 2014. You may refer to our website, cancerprogressbydh.com, for further information on this important conference, which brings together world-class cancer researchers from academia and industry. Also, Therapeutic Insight by Defined Health will be held at EBD Group's BioEurope Spring Partnering Conference. That will take place March 10th through, well, I think it's 11th through 14. I have to look, 10th through 12th in Torino, Italy. To learn more about Defined Health, our capabilities, and our upcoming annual Therapeutic Insight and Cancer Progress conferences, please visit our website at definedhealth.com or send an email or give us a call, and we'll be happy to tell you more. Housekeeping note, Ginger's slides will be up on our website shortly. We'll take questions at the end, but send them as you think of them. If we don't get to them, we'll follow up in the next day or so. Thank you very much, and enjoy the presentation. Ginger?
Thank you, Ginny. Let me go back here just to start. I first gave this webinar, I think it was October of last year, and went back through the slide deck to update and was surprised that there's been actually lots of activity with some high-profile successes, such as Acadia's pimavanserin for Parkinson's psychosis, and unfortunately some failures, most notably being Biogen IDEX dexpramipexole for ALS and Seaside Therapeutics' recent announcement of the failure of arbaclofen for Fragile X. So we'll talk through some of those in addition to some historical references. So I want to start here. Central nervous system disorders, as you all know, is a therapeutic category for drug development that's going through some tough times. The significant scientific and clinical risk that's always been associated with CNS drug development is now combined with commercial risk, particularly in some of the bigger disease areas such as depression, anxiety, epilepsy, migraine, that are dominated by a generic standard of care. So we're now seeing some of the premier players in the space spinning out CNS R&D or exiting the space completely. And on this slide is just a few of the big pharma slashes, cuts, and shutdowns in CNS. However, there are companies that are not ready to give up on CNS, and they see an opportunity to balance the risk by targeting orphan diseases as well as high unmet need segments of bigger markets or diseases. I hear an echo. Sorry, I hear an echo. Starting with orphan disease. By definition, in the U.S., the disease is considered to be orphan if it affects fewer than 200,000 individuals, and in the EU, if it's defined as having a prevalence of fewer than 5 in 10,000 people. Orphan diseases are often, but not always, serious, chronic, and or progressively disabling. They can be life-limiting or even life-threatening. According to the U.S. National Institutes of Health, there are about 7,000 described orphan diseases. The Orphan Drug Act was approved, amazingly, 20 years ago in 1983 to support and promote the development of treatments for rare diseases. This legislation created much promise in terms of both development and commercialization benefits, which include some of the things we've listed there: low-cost, short development timelines, a friendly and collaborative regulatory process, economic incentives, minimal commercialization efforts, going after a very targeted prescriber base, pricing flexibility, and maybe the biggest, most pertinent benefit being the 7 years of market exclusivity. So pharma is embracing the orphan strategy. It took them a while, but they are now aggressively pursuing orphan strategies, almost all of them. And a 2013 Data Monitor report states that in 2011, Big Pharma accounted for over 70% of approved orphan sales. And of course, there are multiple biotech, big and small, also pursuing orphan strategies. So why the interest? Orphan disease is a multi-billion-dollar category and growing. And this chart is from a recent Evaluate Pharma report that shows that the market for orphan drugs, based on consensus forecasts for the leading 500 pharma and biotech companies, is expected to grow by 7.4% per year between 2012 and 2018 to $127 billion. And this is almost double the growth of the overall prescription drug market. But we're starting to see that orphan does not automatically mean high price, big market. And one of the more recent and more high-profile examples is Subsegments. I sure hope I'm saying that right. This is not a CNS example, but I think it's very telling. This is a delayed release version of Cysteamine, or Cystagon, which is the brand drug that was approved in the 1990s, and Raptor Therapeutics has developed Subsegments for an ultra-rare indication, which is nephropathic cystinosis. It improves on the currently available version in terms of dosing schedule, eliminating a middle-of-the-night dose, and improves on unpleasant tolerability issues such as a rotten egg smell, and it also comes out in body odor. So, compliance is a real issue here. And the consequence of inadequate compliance can be life-threatening in this case and result in the need for kidney transplant or even early death. But what we see, and this is May 20th, 2013, BioCentury, who's paying for Subsegments? Even with the compelling value proposition, payers are pushing back in the context of a 25-fold less expensive standard of care, and they're asking for long-term outcomes data that will take years to generate. You have to put this in the context of this being ultra-orphan with 1,000 patients in the U.S. And the struggle that the company goes through in terms of pricing to make this drug commercially viable. So back to CNS, of the 60 or so orphan drugs on the market, we see about 17% are CNS related, and this is compared to oncology, which dominates the orphan drug approvals and accounts for 33%. This is a little old, 2006 to 2011. Cancer orphans is driven by several things, such as certainly high unmet need, but also the ability to stratify patient segments by clinically distinct cancer subtypes, often with a genetic association. In cancer, historically, orphan indications have been market entry strategies for some of the bigger tumor types. If we look at the pipeline, it looks like the CNS gap may be widening, with less than 10% of orphan drugs in development for CNS indications. And this is despite significant high unmet need associated with most of the hundreds or so CNS orphan indications. But we do see a few in the pipeline, such as neurodegenerative disease, ALS and Huntington's, developmental learning disabilities, Fragile X, spinal cord injury, intractable refractory epilepsy. So, big question, why does CNS seem to be lagging in the orphan race? Not impossible, but CNS is still CNS, whether it's big markets or orphan, and we still have the challenges of holding through for the orphan diseases. Just listed them there. If you're in the space of CNS, you live by these. And, in addition to things like subjective endpoints and high placebo rates, the science is typically in its infancy, and clinical and regulatory pathways are just starting to be developed. This graphic is illustrative, not meant to be comprehensive, pulled out some of the currently marketed orphan CNS products. And in general, we see there are 3 groups of orphan CNS drugs on the market, and they're separated by an average cost of therapy, annual cost of therapy, which typically reflects a differentiation from standard of care and level of benefit to the patient. So I'll go through these groups in the presentation, but I want to bring to your attention to the discrepancy in the price of orphan CNS drugs and those that are truly life-altering or even life-saving, which are in the little box on the top right. One example is Solaris, which is Alexion's drug. It's at the top of the list in terms of value and price at about $400,000 a year, and it's used to treat paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, mouthful, a rare blood disease that affects about 8,000 people in the U.S. and results from the destruction of red blood cells. Treatment with Solaris reportedly results in about a 90% reduction in the most serious complication of the disease that can result in death. So if we start with MS drugs, and I'm talking about the disease-modifying interferons such as beta-sera and Avonex, and Copaxone in there, these really set the bar as the first group of truly successful CNS orphan drugs. They're targeting a medically relevant subsegment of the overall MS patient population, which is the relapsing remitting form of the disease, which by the numbers qualifies them as orphan drugs. And this just shows you the success of the market, being that the value proposition, again, is very clear. It's delay of disease progression. And as a result, there's been impressive pricing, some aggressive price increases, certainly over the last 5 or 6 years, resulting in a $14+ billion market worldwide, growing to 17 estimates in 2017, and has big pharma all over it. So now we're looking at Ampyra, which is a symptomatic MS therapy, and it is the story of struggling to establish market access. So just to go through that, Ampyra, known as Fampyra in Europe, is an extended-release oral agent that blocks axonal potassium channels. It was approved in 2010 with an indication to improve walking in patients with MS, walking speed. While the data suggests a real benefit, the payers are certainly pushing back. In the U.S., the payers are asking that patients complete a 25-foot walk test to establish effectiveness of the therapy on a regular basis to justify payment. And Accord's partner outside the U.S., being Pfizer and IDEC, has really been through the hoops with the European payers. After an initial rejection in the EU, the CHMP recommended conditional marketing authorization for Fampyra in May 2011. And finally, the drug was launched in Europe, but in May of last year, Germany ruled that Fampyra was associated with no incremental benefit to the patient, which further complicates the still ongoing pricing negotiations in Europe. And incremental benefit over walking speed was in terms of things like better coordination, balance, and stamina. So things beyond the primary endpoint and really outcomes. So if we look beyond MS, and I don't want to imply that any of these drugs have no value. This is just, so these, you can see a scale, and it's completely impressive to me that any of these made it through the clinical and regulatory challenges and, have created value for patients and the companies that are marketing them. But at the lower end, we see those products that are perceived to add modest improvement over standard of care, which limits the pricing flexibility. So, for example, Kufosa is an oral solution reformulation of glycopyrrolate, and it's indicated for the treatment of severe drooling, which is associated with a variety of neurological conditions. Couposa is based on a generically available compound, and that is used to treat ulcers and reduce salivation in patients under anesthesia. So this formulation is a cherry-flavored oral solution. It's specifically targeted to the pediatric patient population, such as kids with cerebral palsy. And in those kids, drooling not only impacts quality of life, but it can seriously diminish the patient's ability to swallow. So there is a medical benefit there too. But if you look at what the payers are thinking or doing, this is one example of RegentsRx, which is a large pharmacy benefit manager. And you see there in the blurb, their conclusion is that in the context of an existing standard of care, which is 4 times less expensive, supposed to provide the benefit more in terms of convenience. And so they have placed it on a non-preferred, non-formulary list. Now turning to biotech, also at the lower end of the pricing scale. However, I would argue that biotech should certainly be priced higher than it is, and I'll kind of walk through that. Biotech is a really interesting story. It's one of, if not the first, orphan CNS drug. It's indicated for the treatment of ALS, which, as you know, is a truly terrible progressive disease, causes muscle weakness, disability, and eventually death, with most patients dying within 3 to 4 years of diagnosis. However, with all of the body falling apart, the cognitive abilities remain intact, which is sort of a double whammy for these patients. The exact mechanism of action is not completely clear, but it's believed to modulate glutamate signaling. And it was approved in 1995 based on the results of 2 phase 3 studies, which showed an average of 3-month increase in survival or time to tracheostomy. But measures of muscle strength and neurological function did not show a benefit. So survival, but not function. Even so, key opinion leaders consider biotech as an important component of care for a desperate disease with no other option. So again, this is in the context of compared to the standard of care, which there is no standard of care in this case. But even here, at some point in a rapidly progressing disease such as ALS, the benefit does not outweigh the cost. Even if the cost to the patient is minimal. So ALS has been a really tough space, but we have made a lot of progress in terms of clinical trials, endpoints. I'll go through some of this here, but I'll say were 2 next-generation ALS drugs in late-stage development after, again, 20 years since biotech. One of them, unfortunately, big red X on it, failed in phase 3 studies, and that's by dexpramipexole, and the other and that was a neuroprotective agent, and the other addresses muscle strength and function, and that's cytokinetic tyrosinolysis. I'll talk through actually both of these because I think that dexpramipexole is still worth spending time on for lessons learned. Just to give you a sense of what it is and its mechanism, it's an enantiomer of pramipexole, which is a trade name Mirapex, which is a dopamine agonist for the treatment of Parkinson's and restless leg syndrome. And studies showed that dexpramipexole exhibits neuroprotective capabilities compared to pramipexole, potentially mediated through the modulation of aberrant mitochondrial ion channel conductance. But in this case, with significantly reduced affinity towards dopamine receptors and less associated side effects, most importantly being those of somnolence, vivid dreams, loss of impulse control. So before partnering with Biogen, IDEC NOP completed a 2-part double-blind phase 2 trial and published the results in Nature Medicine in 2011. Part 1 analyzed multiple BID doses versus placebo over 12 weeks, and Part 2 was a 24-week trial following a placebo washout period. The phase 2 study is considered, and this is quote-unquote, better than any other ALS phase 2 trial, according to a quote from a KOL. It showed clear safety and tolerability benefit, as well as dose-dependent trend in slowing the rate of disease progression using the ALS-FRS score. This score predicts survival, which is very important compared to what was used in the biotech trial. So you no longer need to use a true survival endpoint, which is really important for this indication and new medications, and at the highest dose, a significant improvement in functional outcomes. Still, the phase 3 EMPOWER trial failed to show significance on any measure in the trial, despite the phase 2, better than any other ALS phase 2 trial, quote unquote. Despite this disappointment, there were some important lessons learned. I've talked about some of them already. A new measure of drug benefit was tested, found to be robust enough for use in future trials. A new system for identifying ALS patients at the earliest stages, which is always key to neurodegenerative disorders, where you need to get in before the damage is done. And a new system for identifying, any differences between patients on and off riluzole supported survival benefit of that drug in a trial that was more sophisticated than the one that led to its initial approval. And I think this is further entrenching riluzole as a standard of care. Lastly, the trial emphasized the importance of biomarkers to track drug response and disease progression and guide clinical development. And we've heard from several people in the industry, particularly for neuroprotective or disease-modifying therapies, that they're not going to do this again unless they have a clear biomarker to guide the trial. So now I'm going to turn to tirasemtiv, which is being positioned as a symptomatic versus a neuroprotective or disease-modifying therapy. This drug is being developed by Cytokinetics, which is a company with focused expertise in the cytoskeleton and biology of muscle function. The next several slides give some of the data here, but just from a top view, this mechanism combined with the disease, it just makes a lot of sense. This is a small molecule. It aims to impact skeletal muscle contraction by selectively activating the fast skeletal muscle troponin complex and increasing its sensitivity to calcium. This effect has the potential to result in increased skeletal muscle force and delaying the time to muscle fatigue. So proof of concept for this drug was established in 3 phase 2A trials, which included a total of about 140 ALS patients. These trials were primarily designed to test the compound's safety and tolerability. In addition, they were looking for signs of efficacy. Data was reported at the 2011 and 2012 AAN meetings and showed that tirasemtiv was well tolerated with some transient dizziness, but no serious adverse events were observed. While it was not powered to show significance in efficacy endpoints, tirasemtiv showed a positive trend in efficacy measured in all 3 of the studies. So this slide takes a closer look at data for one of the phase 2A trials, which is CY4024. There's 2 parts to this trial. In Part A, patients did not receive Rilutech in addition to tirasemtiv or placebo, and in Part B, they did. In addition to safety and tolerability, the efficacy endpoints were the ALS-FRS score, which I talked about. But again, it's used to monitor the progression of disability, looking at 12 domains. So very comprehensive, looks at speech, some of the domains, speech, salivation, swallowing, walking, handwriting, and the MBV scale, which measures pulmonary function. So in this test, you can see positive trend seen in both of those outcomes, in both of those endpoints. Currently, is that right? Yeah. Tirasemtiv is currently being studied in a phase 2 benefit trial, which will include about 500 patients over a course of just 12 weeks, measuring the same clinical endpoints I just described. And the results of this study, combined with the previously conducted trials, are expected to inform global registration. And this is really a fast-paced program and something to keep your eye on. And it's important to note that tirasemtiv's mechanism has potential use across multiple orphan and non-orphan indications where muscle weakness and fatigue are symptoms. Here are 2 recent press releases from Cytokinetics. One announces positive phase 2A data in myasthenia gravis, and a grant to support preclinical research in spinal muscular atrophy. But if you think about it, in some of the bigger patient populations, muscle weakness and fatigue in older patients, very large patient populations where a drug like this or this mechanism could have potential utility. So moving on to the next group. Clearly establishing and building value. A-side sodium channel modulator, rufinamide, Banzol, is approved for a type of intractable childhood epilepsy called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is a real unmet need. It was also in clinical development for adult partial onset epilepsy, which is definitely not an orphan indication, but it received a non-approvable letter for use in that indication. So it's certainly adds value to the intractable childhood epilepsy, but the market potential there has been diminished with a non-approvable and partial onset epilepsy. Jazz Pharmaceutical Xyrem is a story of building value and price over time, and I'll go through that story in the next couple of slides. So a lot going on in that slide, but Xyrem, which is sodium oxybate, is the only FDA-approved medication for narcolepsy with cataplexy and excessive daytime sleepiness. It was approved in 2002. Cataplexy is found in about 60 to 70% of narcoleptic patients, and it's characterized by a brief but sudden onset or loss of muscle tone. And the danger is more in the generalized cataplexy where patients can suddenly collapse. So if you think about it, it gravely affects patient quality of life, and even more than that, it can result in inability to work or study, to drive, and can result in serious accidents. This drug, sodium oxybate, is derived from GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate, which is a DEA Schedule I controlled substance with a high risk of abuse and diversion. And so it is distributed under an incredibly tight REMS program, which is important on the next slide. And revenues for Xyrem are now approaching, you'll see, 2012, $400 million, with analyst projections of over $1 billion by 2016. And much of that is driven by price increases you see on the bottom of this slide. But many other things are establishing and building the value of Xyrem. So here, I've called out just a few. A combination of data, intellectual property, and other protections to justify this increase in price. So just some of the highlights, Xyrem is now specified in clinical guidelines as a treatment standard. Post-marketing studies show a surprisingly low level of abuse and diversion. The restricted access program gives assistance to physicians, patient education, nursing guidance. The brand has amassed impressive protection through a combination of orphan status for sure, the REMS program, and the associated restricted access and patient registry, making it very difficult for generic versions to enter the market. In addition, kind of a side note, but I think it's important, The positive side of a rejection here is that it was in development for restless leg syndrome indication, and it failed in 2002. So being orphan, only orphan, has much more pricing flexibility. So if we move to the top of the value chain in terms of pricing again, we see a group of drugs and the MS disease-modifying drugs, which I've already talked about, but also 2 drugs which are indicated for infantile spasms, and xenazine, which is the first drug approved for Huntington's disease. Well, infantile spasms are associated with significant risk of mortality and morbidity, and inadequate or delayed treatment results in severe mental disability or even death. And this has been well documented in long-term outcome studies. So the goal of treatment is to treat as soon and aggressively as possible. Both Sabril, which is a GABA inhibitor, and Acthar, which is a corticotropin, are considered the standard of care for infantile spasms, and they both significantly decrease or cease seizures altogether. So vastly improved long-term outcomes. Acthar is also indicated for the exacerbations on there, the exacerbations of MS, nephrotic syndrome, and a rare dermatological autoimmune disorder. Acthar and the company that markets it, Questcor, has generated some controversy over the past several years as it raised its price, particularly when it first was indicated for infantile spasms, with almost a 15-fold overnight increase in price. However, with the extended label indications, the payers are really starting to push back. And if you see, and it's interesting to go look at the stock price and see what happened in 2012, and not in 2012, but with the into the September 2012, when Aetna said they would no longer cover, that was at a time when only 10% of Acthar's $500 million sales at the time were from infantile spasms. The stock price has certainly come way back up, but it was just slammed. Growth is expected, as you see from the graphic on the bottom, from some of the larger indications such as nephrotic syndrome. And this New York Times article, I won't read it, but outlines some of the pricing issues and controversies that companies can probably expect as they go in with an orphan and then move into larger patient populations depending on how they're priced. So another small orphan indication that may lead to a much larger indication is Fragile X. And Fragile X is one of the few CNS orphans that recently has been of real interest to big pharma. Several big pharma having programs here, like Novartis, Roche, Pfizer too. I don't have it on the slide. And again, one of the reasons maybe that some of the mechanisms, such as the modulation of glutamate, like Novartis's mGluR5 and antagonists, and gamma modulation, have potential utility in the broader autism spectrum disorders. Autism is a patient population that's really hard to get a handle on in terms of epidemiology, but it's certainly big and in the millions. And another reason that Fragile X has been of interest is that it's a single gene disorder, like Huntington's, caused by a mutation in the FMR1 gene on the X chromosome. It results in learning, psychosocial, and behavioral impairment. Well, certainly not all kids with Fragile X have autism, and not all cases of autism have the single gene mutation. The association certainly exists. And again, just going through the slide deck and updating on recent activity in this space. June 6th, we saw the unfortunate report from Seaside Therapeutics that was partnered with Roche that arbaclofen, which is a derivative of the muscle relaxer baclofen, did not meet the goal of reducing social withdrawal in children and adults with autism. This is a 150-patient study. This is following failures in trials looking at irritability in Fragile X. Did I say that first study in autism was looking at social withdrawal? That's important here because it points out some of the challenges in teasing out specific symptoms for a syndrome. So if you're looking at things like irritability and social withdrawal in a complex disorder such as Fragile X or autism, it's difficult to tease those out and get significance in a statistical way. And again, in the context where the severity varies widely across these patient populations. So given the failures, the potential partner, Roche, says that it's decided not to pursue or not to license our baclofen, and guessing that ends financial support for the studies. So we'll have to see what happens with Seaside. And the quote from Luca Santarelli, head of neuroscience, Roche, is included here. It says, "We concluded that our baclofen wasn't going to provide a real difference for patients," and that's the reason they backed out. So moving on to Xenazine, this is Lundbeck's drug, and it's the only FDA-approved treatment for chorea, or any symptom for that matter, associated with Huntington's disease. Xenazine selectively inhibits vesicular monoamine transporter enzyme, or VMAT2, and depletes presynaptic dopamine. Patient uptake has been robust, and the ability to price at $30 to $50 depending on the dose has really been a surprise. And the payers are pushing back somewhat, but minimally. And as I said, like Fragile X, Huntington's is a single gene disorder, but most of the activity in terms of clinical development for this disorder is in terms of symptomatic therapy. We're not seeing anything like single gene disorder, drugs targeting the single gene disorders like we do in lysosomal storage diseases in the space of CNS. But anyway, Xenazine was important, or is important, in that it created value where there really was none. Efficacy for this drug was established in a 13-week study and in an open-label extension trial of up to 80 weeks. The primary endpoint was chorea, using total maximal chorea score from the UHDRS, which assesses 4 domains of clinical performance and capacity in HD: motor function, cognitive function, behavioral abnormalities, and functional capacities. The secondary endpoints here were clinical global impression scale and individual sections of the UHDRS. At 80 weeks, however, there was a reduction in the mean TMC score by 4.6, which is considered meaningful, but it did not impact cognition or functional scales of global improvement. That's in a longer-term study. So even though Xenazine certainly adds value over the standard of care for Huntington's, it leaves room to address unmet need. There are some troubling side effects, such as somnolence, dysphagia, increase in Parkinson's symptoms, Parkinsonian symptoms, which is a real problem in Huntington's patients. Has a black box warning for depression and suicidal thoughts and behavior, and again, not ideal for this patient population, already at high risk of suicide, and addresses only one domain of the disease, which is the motor symptoms, and even there, only the chorea type movements. It does not impact cognition or the psychiatric symptoms. This slide just says, looking at Lundbeck, and they have 3 orphan CNS drugs, and as I said many times, have add value, but are not hitting the blockbuster size that Lundbeck has grown up on with some of their big markets. So if you see Xenazine is $280 million, peak, Sabril is $100 million, Onfi, which is $90 million. They're still willing to take on the big market risk. One drug I pulled out is Brintalex, which is a multimodal antidepressant. It upregulates all kinds of monoamine: serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, acetylcholine, histamine. Expected approval is sometime in 2013, and the profile of this drug is that its efficacy is pretty similar to existing antidepressants, although it's studied in patients that have failed other SSRIs first line, but with a better profile on several things: sexual dysfunction, nausea, and cognition. And you see some of the, from one study, sexual dysfunction summary at the bottom of this slide, and difference in incidence from placebo with, and this is compared to Cymbalta, so they did head-to-head studies here. Analysts estimate that the revenues for this drug at well over $1 billion. I've seen $3+ billion, but the cost to get there is steep, and the risk is, incredible. This drug has been filed on the basis of 10 phase 3 studies, 70 of which met the primary endpoint, and this is across 7,500 patients. So you see the magnitude of that regulatory package. So leaving Orphans, and we just have a 15 or so minutes here, which I think I'll probably finish early, moving into subsegments of larger patient populations, and this is things like depression, where you're looking at treatment-resistant depression. I'll go over it in the next slide. But let me back up a little. So pharma is taking a look at these big markets and saying, how can we de-risk in terms of sub-segmenting? And these are things like medically relevant subsegments, which may or may not be an orphan indication. Specialty markets, and by that I mean diseases treated by a relatively small number of specialists. Disease subsegments to guide development and identify responders, the use of biomarkers, and the use of companion diagnostics. Not all of these are available in the world of CNS right now, but certainly things like medically relevant subsegments and specialty markets for things like, infusion therapies, or treating the tougher to treat patients with non-oral, more invasive methods of delivery are things that that companies developing CNS drugs are looking into. So a little bit more on medically relevant subsegments. Again, things like intractable disease, refractory epilepsy, treatment-resistant depression, patient segments with debilitating symptoms such as migraine with severe nausea and vomiting, early onset aggressive disease like pediatric multiple sclerosis, symptoms associated with late-stage advanced disease such as motor complications associated with Parkinson's disease, more advanced Parkinson's disease, and lastly, and I think really importantly, is disabling comorbid symptoms such as extreme fatigue in MS, patients' cognitive impairment, and Parkinson's disease. This is a category of, subsegments, I guess, that I've called supportive neurology. I did a webinar on this, 3-4 years ago, and still see this as commercially viable, and I think I'm really encouraged by, I think I'll skip this one. This just is showing what the doctors say. I think for supportive neurology, I'm really encouraged by pimavanserin, which is now phase 3, and it's, in addition to tirasemtiv, I think it's one of the later stage agents that's worth keeping an eye on. This is Acadia's compound. It's a 5-HT antagonist inverse agonist. And the target here is psychosis in Parkinson's patients. And just to describe that a little, Parkinson's disease psychosis, which is also referred to as PDP, is debilitating. It develops in up to 60% of patients over time, Parkinson's patients. PDP is associated with increased caregiver stress and burden, nursing home placement, increased morbidity, mortality. So there's a whole cost of care if you're looking from at a 360 cost of care. The level of unmet need is blindingly clear in that PDP is treated off-label and aggressively treated off-label with antipsychotics, despite a black box warning related to increased risk of death in the patient population. In addition, the dopaminergic agents, such as the antipsychotics, can exacerbate motor symptoms, which again is a real problem in the Parkinson's patients. Peak year revenue estimates, and these are just analyst estimates, and we don't really have a price estimate here, but are in the range of potentially being $1 billion at peak. But to look at some of the data, in the pivotal phase 3 study, this data was announced at the 2013 AAN meeting, and they showed robust and consistent efficacy across a range of measures. Pimavanserin met the primary endpoint of SAPS-PD, and this is a scale to assess psychosis in PD, and the secondary endpoint for motor tolerability. And it also showed significance on the Clinical Global Impression Severity Scale, the Clinical Global Impression Improvement Scale, and the CGI Responder Analysis. So pretty impressive and significance across all measures. So the most recent news I could find on this program was in April of this year, when Acadia announced the FDA will allow an expedited path to an NDA, and this is based on a single pivotal phase 3 study, and of course supported with supported data from their other studies for a registration package. And Acadia is currently targeting the NDA submission end of 2014. The stock chart in the bottom. What they got with the phase 3 results announced, and then the expedited path NDA. So in conclusion, with 10 minutes spare, orphan disorders and subsegments of larger patient populations where high unmet need remains offer potential opportunities to balance the risk-reward profile in CNS. Disease modification and neuroprotective agents, and certainly a cure is the holy grail here. I hope that I've pointed out that many CNS disorders are in desperate need of symptomatic improvement and improved function and quality of life. And this holds true for CNS orphans and subsegments of the larger patient populations. While the absolute scientific risk remains high for these programs, and clinical risk too, being CNS, the risk-adjusted profile or benefit looks a whole lot better than it does for the traditional big CNS diseases, with these being smaller, shorter clinical studies, potentially less safety risk and high unmet need, safety tolerability, I guess, in high unmet need patient groups. And in addition, the cost of failure is significantly lower than for the bigger indications, and the reward can be quite meaningful. So, in conclusion, to realize value, companies must clearly define, measure, and quantify meaningful value to all stakeholders, and that is inclusive of physicians, patients, caregivers, and the payers. And with that, I'll return it back over to Jenny.
Thank you, Ginger. We don't have any questions rolled in yet, so please feel free to send them if you like, and or give us a call or shout out by email. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll let you know when we're going to put on our next Insight Series briefing. Thank you. Have a good day or evening. Bye.